Well, all right, here we go with the second video to part 3, the beginning. And in this section, we're going to get into the Old Testament. And here's where I have two substantial kind of doctrinal departures from how religious is practiced. And it works for me, it makes sense for me. And in taking this approach esoterically, looking at the esoteric meaning, which once again, exoteric is kind of what you see physically manifested and maybe relates to behavioral modification and its results. The esoteric is all about what's going on inside of you. And if you look at the Old Testament esoterically in the New Testament, it aligns perfectly. I mean, it's just a beautiful alignment, and it reconciles the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New. And I hope I can impress that upon you. Now, obviously, it's in the book. And once again, this video, we're talking about this book, story from Genesis to Revelation, a story you find yourself in. And the press release is about to go out, and I have to get these videos done. And this was the first book. And we're going to talk about some stuff in this book. But the last video abruptly ended with me saying meditation and talking about Dr. LaPera and her impact on my life. And she was my sole resource, really, to go through my experience of kind of an ego collapse and awakening. And you're making lemonade out of lemons, and that's what we're going to be talking about. The other person that, before I get into Old Testament, the other person that I hold in great esteem is Gabor Mate, psychologist, focus on addiction, and then the origin, of these addictive natures. And that gets back to child psychology and the child wound. And if you have kids, read his stuff. If you're about to have kids, read his stuff. It's really good. And he talks about a child wound, how it manifests inside of you, and this kind of goes on line with Lee Bladen's work on how the ego is constructed. So, you have something, you have an authentic nature when you're born, you're pristine. And the goal is let's get back to that so we can enter the kingdom of heaven as Jesus says. You got to be like babies. You got to be like children. And that's before the ego gets developed. But it gets developed by these experiences that you have at an early age. And the ego is necessary, and it's absolutely how we're designed to do this trip, knowing both good and evil. Because that's the Old Testament trip that we're on, and it shows that. And we're all here to do that trip first, and then we want to find the tree of life so we can take of it. And that's the New Testament. But really, we're in that quest for the knowledge of good and evil until we're finished. And so that's really most of all we know until that event. And that's impacted by how our ego gets constructed. And so these events where you have this authentic you, and then you have an experience, trauma, it doesn't have to be big, but it's a thought, or it's a response, or it's an emotion that you can't express the way you want to, because you're so dependent as a child. That's the person that you depend on, your parents, that you're going to do everything you got to do to make them happy. And you digest everything that they are unhappy with as something that's wrong with you. And so you'll take that behavior or that emotion unknowingly, and you tuck it away. And then there's a barrier, there's defense mechanisms built around it to protect you from having to feel whatever it is you felt. And that's necessary, that protects you. But then that takes away a part of your authentic personality. And so then you're forced as a persona to develop an inauthentic counter to needing to be able to be expressive for the thing that you're missing, but you still have to interact with the world, so you've got to deliver something, and it's not authentic. It's not the authentic you. Now you are developing a false persona because you were taught that whatever you experienced was bad. And it could be even as much as a little thought that got rejected. Man, there it goes. There's that little nugget in there, and there's a wall built around it. And if it's a big wall, if it's a big issue, you'll have, and it happens repeatedly, you'll have a number of walls and protections, and it could get really big. And if it's so invasive, persuasive to your personality, it begins to affect other aspects unknowingly and create another little fiefdom down there that's protected. And you kind of look at it as a little fortress. And it's going to be protected at all costs by the ego. It doesn't want you going there. And I think we all have a giant one, at least one, but we have hundreds of other little ones. And the goal with shadow work is to go in and find those. And all you have to do is observe it. You have to learn that art of being able to observe, and they will dissolve. But for those big ones, it takes some work, because you got layers and layers and layers, and you got to understand how to get there. Now, for me, my big child wound was potty training, as I said earlier, and it sounds kind of funny, but it's just not. It was tragic, and I had disassociated my whole life, and that's one thing as a codependent. That's one thing that Dr. LaPera says that was the same way that she reacted. It was one of her coping mechanisms. You're in an environment that you just can't hardly function in, and the way you deal with it is you just disassociate. And I disconnected from my family for the most part and focused on my friends, and that's how I lived my life. But I don't have memories, and that's what Dr. LaPera said. I just don't have memories of my childhood, and I don't have memories. I have friends that say, "Hey, you remember we did this and this?" And I go, "Uh-uh." And they go, "Man, what is wrong with you?" I had a roommate in college that I went to go play golf with a group of guys. And, hey, I don't remember you. And it was just like, you just kind of feel like I got dementia, but I just don't have those memories. And it's sad. I kind of live my life in moments, but I never connected anything in between. So there's all different ways coping mechanisms, come about and develop, and what they look like. But going in there and observing them, it tends to just start to dissolve away. You don't have to try to do anything. You just have to see it, and that gets you back to that pristine, back like a baby, back to your authentic personality. And I can honestly say I'm a different person than I was. And it just feels fantastic that I can see the authentic Stu for the first time. I just wish it would have happened before I turned 62. It's a harsh thing to go through something like this, late middle age. But I did it and I made it through, and I want to help. But once again, I wanted to go find my story in the Bible. After my first book, this was just a story about my journey. The second book is what I found in the Bible, and it fits perfectly with my experience and my story. And that feels even better, that I can see the Bible and say, now I can read it in a context that fits. And so with that, just imagine that these things inside of us, let's call them nations and cities. They're fortresses. And they have a different persona. Every one of them is protected by a different kind of thing. Maybe we have a big problem in our country with porn. Maybe something that happened there in your life, and that's your giant, that you've got to deal with. But going back to mine, it's potty training, and when those memories started coming back, the first memory I had was I'm over the toilet cleaning out a cloth diaper, I mean, I can't even talk. I mean, this is the beginning of potty training. And my dad's standing over me, boxer underwear, and he's got a cigarette hanging from his mouth, and angry as just an angry son of a bitch. And I was scared. And it's nasty. And so, shame and humiliation, he tried to shame me and humiliate me into not pooping in my diaper. That didn't work. It took me forever to get potty trained. I was scared. They found me one time in the family treehouse in the backyard, my diaper full, and they were all looking for me. They were screaming, "Hey, Stu." I'm just like, no. And I'm a little toddler, climbed up the freaking tree, the steps of the tree to hide from my dad. But my fear of humiliation and shame was intense. And it just messed up my life. But I wound that through. Like I said, this book, when I went through this period, I documented every meditation in a journal. And this is the section that talks about that experience. And you can see in the dark print is my actual unedited journal entry off the pieces of paper. And I took pictures of that table when it was happening. I just wanted to document this incredible night. It was April 5th, 2019, and it lasted all night. At one point, I'm walking around the house, God help me, God help me, God help me. I'm freaking out. And the picture of the table, it had a brown tablecloth, and it's pit marked with tears and papers everywhere. And it was a rock your world experience. And that was the beginning of an awakening. Because once I plowed through Baby Stu, and in the book, it's just Baby Stu was sitting there just angry, just pissed. He just wanted to be held, he just wanted to be loved. He had never felt that before. And in those journal entries, it says, hey, after that moment, I felt that unconditional love, really, really for the first time. And the very next entry related to the trauma bond that I had just the week before exited abruptly and unexpectedly. I just got out of it just to save myself because I really was close to suicide. And in these journal entries, Baby Stu's saying, man, thank God you found me in time because I almost killed you. And it was crazy. But we have those, and you got to go in to figure it out. And I'm going to go back to the butterfly and the caterpillar at this point. I look at the Old Testament, and this is our caterpillar crawl, the knowledge of good and evil. In our persona that sets us up, this ego persona that allows it to happen. And I'm going to call it something different in a minute. But modern psychology, ego self, that's what people tend to go. And then the butterfly is the other side of it. And that's important for the ending. But I had this visual, I'm saying, here's a caterpillar, he's crawling on the ground, the dust of the ground, which is what we're told we do in the Old Testament. And he's ugly, and he's slow, doesn't like him. And all he's worried about is something coming around and wanting to eat him. Because, caterpillars are pretty good food for birds and such, and he's afraid. He's just afraid. And the butterfly comes fluttering around, and he sees it, and he goes, man, you're so pretty, I wish I could fly. The butterfly lands and goes, hey, you can fly. I mean, you're going to be just like me. And the caterpillar's like, what, are you kidding me? You can fly. You're pretty. I'm ugly, and I'm crawling on the ground. There's no way I'm going to be like you. And the butterfly, yeah, you will. See that tree right there? That's your tree of life right there. You need to crawl up to that fourth branch, and you need a cocoon. Wrap yourself up really good. Get away from everything. Get safe. And then it's going to be hard because it's going to hurt. You're going to change. And you're going to turn into to a butterfly. But at first you're going to be all scrunched up. Your wings are going to be all cramped. But then when you come out of the cocoon, it's going to hurt again because you're going to stretch those wings. But you got to have them. You got to have those wings to get to the 5th branch. And then you're going to fly to the 6th branch. And then when you get to the 7th branch, you're going to be just like me. You can go anywhere you want. You're going to be pretty. So just hold on to that visual, because for me, these visuals help. In the Bible, that's all it is. It's all visuals. So with that, let's get to Adam and Eve. And once again, there's two big points that I want to get to. And this is already 15, 16 minutes into it. Okay, got my glasses on because I'm going to be reading. And once again, I'm going to go to the verse. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us, how will our end come?" Jesus said, "Have you found the beginning then, that you are looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning. That one will know the end and will not taste death." And these are going to be from the Gnostic of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas. He's a Gnostic gospel. And sure wish it was in the canon, but I think I understand why it's not. So, what is the beginning? What is the beginning for us? And Adam and Eve, how do we practice? Adam and Eve are two separate people. The Bible is the lineage of Adam and Eve. And all that happens, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but all that happens is chronicled and logged. And if it actually did happen, it's even more cool. And I'm not saying it didn't. Esoterically, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it happened or not. It's what it's showing you. So I'm going to go to, well, first of all, Adam and Eve are two separate people, and they made a mistake. They got tempted by the serpent, and they were kicked out of heaven and kicked out of the garden, and now we're all paying the penance for that original sin. And I can't tell you the number of sermons I've heard. Hey, we're worthless, we're sinful, and just save us, God. And then you can make this declaratory prayer and say, hey, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you're saved. But then you've got to improve your behavior. And if your behavior is representative of making that declaration, then you're saved. And if that behavior is not, then you were never saved. And there's always these sermons. How do you know are you really sure you're saved? I mean, what a messed up way to live. And I did it my whole life. It's fear, and you get one shot, and it's over. And I just can't imagine that's what God has designed for us, and I don't think it is. So, and then you get to the end time prophecy. I mean, it's like, it's going to be really bad. And so you have the exoteric. It's what you see. It's what's out there, physically manifested. The esoteric. It's the inside game. And the Old Testament shows us kind of what that journey looks like. They're kind of one and the same. Old Testament's the caterpillar crawl. So I'm going to go to verse 11. Jesus said, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. During the days when you ate what is dead, you made it come alive. When you're in the light, what will you do?" And here it is. "On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, what will you do?" And so Jesus is saying, there was one day that you were one, and you became two. And when you become two, what are you going to do with that? So we start out this trip as one in the beginning. Then we became two, And then our goal is to get back to the beginning, which means we need to become one again. And so I'm going to go to the next verse I want to go to is verse 22. And we've kind of hit on this. Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to the disciples, "These nursing babies are like those who enter the kingdom, the Father's kingdom." They said to him, "Then shall we enter the Father's kingdom as babies?" Jesus said to them, "When you make two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, and hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom." Well, the image thing is really key for the Revelation account. But the beginning is important to say, you start off as one, and your goal is to make the two back into one. And then the next one I want to cite is 29. Jesus said, "If the flesh came into being because of spirit, that is a marvel. But if spirit came into being because of the body, that is a marvel of marvels. Yet I marvel at how this great wealth has come to dwell in this poverty." I mean, you can imagine, the whole cliche, we have spiritual beings having a physical experience, or physical beings having a spiritual experience. If you're physical, then you're looking for some spiritual manifestation that changes you from one to the other. But if you're spirit coming into a body to have an experience, and then you reconcile that back at the end to your original condition, and that's even crazier. And think about spirit, a soul. Think of the energy that must be to then, and how limitless it is, then to accept coming into this, limited meat sack. It's got to be miserable. But the energy that you have, our bodies are electrical beast. It's like the heart center generates 50 to 60,000 more times magnetism than the brain. There's more neural connections from the heart to the brain than the brain to the heart. And there's 5 to 6 times more electrical energy in the heart than there is in the brain. So the heart is grand central station. It is the deal. And so then let me see here. 106. Jesus said, "When you make the two into one, you will become children of Adam. And when you say mountain, move from here, it will move." And then I'm going to finish. I think I'm going to finish with, to get this started. This is kind of a crazy one. Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." And that's coming back into unity consciousness, and just saying it a different way. And then there's one other thing here that I want to. He says, verse 87, Jesus said, "How miserable is the body that depends on a body, and how miserable is the soul that depends on these two." So the soul, the journey of the soul, because man became a living soul. We're going to see that in just a second. And the Old Testament is the journey of the soul. And then it's the involution into a physical incarnation, the journey of the soul. The New Testament is the evolution, the ascension of the soul into a living, second Adam was a living spirit. We become spiritualized once again, back to our original condition. So getting into Genesis, we have the creation narrative to begin with. And it, God made the heavens and the earth. I can't get into a lot of details, the imagery, but if you look at the creation, and you look at our bodies, and you look at that narrative, what you have to infer that it's the creation versus what you infer with the body, it's the same thing. You just have to choose to see it. But I'm saying, hey, that creation narrative also applies esoterically to the making of our body. And the expanse between the upper and the lower is our heart center. And the light in the heavens, the light's the day, and the below, that's our higher self. The upper, below the earth that was separated between the earth and the sea. The waters parted, they dried, and so the lower part has land and sea, the earth and sea. That's the lower self, that's the dark self. And it's lit by the moon. The heavens lit by the sun, below is lit by the moon. City of Jericho, it's called, it means moon city. And in the Bible, it represents the intellect. And the moon's light, it's not of its own, it's reflected light. And so the man living in the lower self, which is what we start out in, he's living by the intellect. And that intellect, governed by the ego self, which we're going to show later is the serpent persona, can make you believe you're spiritualized until you ascend. And then when you get into the heaven part of the upper self and your eyes open, you see that you're naked. Then the light is from the sun. And the word Pharaoh means sun. And he's that persona that rules in obscurity until we see it. And the vision of the woman giving birth in Revelation, she's sitting on the sun with her feet on the moon. The moon is the footstool for her feet. And that's what it says in the Bible, that Christ, the Son of God, will make his enemies his footstool. And it's those of us living in the intellect, eventually we release that, we let that go when we become spiritualized. But anyways, back to the narrative. Before man's even mentioned, God made the beasts of the earth and the great sea monsters. And the earth is kind of our consciousness initially, but the sea is the subconscious, and we'll see how that symbolism plays out. And so the monsters of the sea are kind of the beast, of our psyche. And then the earth is kind of what happens when your consciousness is not awake. It creates a beast in and of itself. And then we're going to correlate that to the behemoth and Leviathan that shows up in the book of Job. But then God says, hey, let's make man in our image, both male and female. And he does that. But this is before he made a body. This is consciousness. So God said, we're going to make man in our image, and that's male and female. The masculine, divine masculine, and divine feminine. It gets back to June. The animus and the anima. And then, so that's in one consciousness, unity consciousness, still with God. Then God makes man in the next chapter, chapter 2, and then he puts man in the garden. And that symbolizes a place in your body. And the Garden of Eden is your consciousness in a safe place. And unity consciousness with God at that point. Well, then later, he says, man needs a helpmate. He's about to make a decision if he's going to go do this thing on earth. And I got to get him ready. So I'm going to take Eve. He puts Adam in a deep sleep, and he slept. And nowhere else in the book does it say Adam woke up. So Adam's asleep. He takes the male and female, and he separates them. So it's the great cosmic separation. I got a section of the book, it's called the Great Cosmic Separation. So now you have consciousness and the subconscious. Eve is the subconscious, the mother of all living. It's the consciousness that impregnates the subconscious. It's supposed to provide the guidance, the awareness. And you have to have that to have unity. But if the consciousness starts off in a sleep, then you're dead to your spirituality. So you are dead to your spiritual nature, and you're living out of the subconscious. And kind of gets back to the cliche. I mean, I feel like I've been living on autopilot. Well, until you wake up, you do. Your consciousness starts to want to come up, and there's this internal battle going on within you. So, but they're still in unity consciousness at this point because the serpent hasn't entered the picture. I mean, there's been no corruption, and they're still there. They're with God. They're naked and unashamed. That means that they're aware of their consciousness, but because they don't have the judgment and the guilt and the humiliation that comes with the ego, they're not ashamed. They're one with God. Well, then God says, but don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or else you're going to die. And the serpent says, hey, you're not going to die. And Eve saw that it was good and it'd make one wise, and she said, hey, I want to do this. So notice the subconscious is doing this because Adam is not engaged. And then Eve takes of the fruit and she eats, and she says, here, Adam, eat. And all it says is, and he took it and ate. He did what she said. So then later, God comes around, and you can imagine this is going on in your mind. God says, hey, where are you? Well, I'm hiding. And why are you hiding? Did you take of the fruit? Did you eat of the tree that I told you not to? And the woman did, and she told me to, and I did. And so he first admonishes her and says, for that, he admonished the serpent first, but then he admonished Eve, and then he finished with Adam. And you look at how he admonished Adam, and it sure looks like a guy that's not going to be engaged. And Eve has aligned with the serpent. And God says there's going to be enmity between you two forever. And so these are the two natures that we're dealing with. It's this serpent persona, the subconscious, and then through that relationship, the ego gets constructed as the image that we project out to interact with this world. But it's the inner relationship between the serpent and Eve as our subconscious that's making that happen. And until Adam wakes up, it doesn't change. And so I'm advocating this is single consciousness, male and female, separated, with the introduction of this very necessary, beautiful serpent persona that allows us to have this journey of the knowledge of good and evil until we ascend the tree of life. And you can almost picture this divine spark in us that's sitting there, tucked away, undefiled. Because in Revelation it says you're not going to see that part of you until you first see this false you. It's the apostasy, the man of lawlessness. You got to see him first, acknowledge him and the divine in you before you're going to see the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant represents the place where God dwells. And you go back to the Old Testament, the tabernacle followed the Israelites coming out of Egypt. and it was covered in goat hair. And it was temporary. Until you got to the promised land and you could build the permanent temple. Well, God put skins on Adam and Eve, and they pushed them out. That skin represents the covering of that serpent persona, the ego nature. The goat skin on the tabernacle represents the same thing. God traveled with the Israelites on their journey. God travels with each of us on our journey. And he's always there as our divine spark. He was always with the Israelites in the tabernacle. So we have a body tabernacle until we ascend, until we go through the revelation experience. And then we have the body temple. Just like the Israelites had the body the tabernacle, and then the temple. There's a lot in Hebrews about the tabernacle as it relates to Jesus, the holy place, the way, that ties directly to Revelation. It's so cool, but we'll get there into the next section. So then the next thing that happens is they have Cain and Abel. You got to have Cain and Abel to take this trip. Now, esoterically, Cain represents the lower self. He's firstborn, first of the ways of God. When the behemoth is described, he's described as the first of the ways of God. And that basically is saying that's consciousness that's asleep. He lays in the reeds under the lotus plants. And then you have Leviathan, and that's basically this unregenerate heart. It's the beast of the seas, and the sea is your subconscious. So it's the Eve part of us that is not spiritualized, and it's under the influence of the serpent. Pharaoh represents the ruler of Egypt. Egypt is the lowest part of the earth. That's our lowest spirit. And I don't even get into it, but he rules Egypt, and so that's basically, and he rules in obscurity. So he's that serpent persona that's basically ruling the subconscious, Eve, until we begin our journey upwards to be spiritualized. And then the very next place is the second one is kind of that, it's your generative section, your sensuality, and the very next persona of the serpent is represented by Babylon, and then that's Jezebel and Ahab, and Jezebel is in Revelation when they talk about the heart center, and then later Persia comes into the picture because they take out Babylon, and that serpent persona now becomes the king of Tyre. Ezekiel chapter 28, it's just all about that. And it's the serpent persona shedding its skin from the Pharaoh to the Jezebel to the king of Tyre. It's keeping up with your ascension. It's the crafty of all the beasts. I mean, that serpent persona is always one step ahead of you. It knows how you want to feel. You want to feel spiritualized? I'll make you feel spiritualized, but I'm still in charge until I'm not. Then you get into the last one is Greece then conquers Persia, but that's in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's really not a whole lot written about it. But the vision of the ram and the goat's represented by Greece in the Daniel's vision, chapter 8, and the ram symbolizes Media and Persia. So the ascension is in the Media and Persia place, which is the third level, beginning of the third level. And the next conqueror is going to be Greece. Greece is going to come in and take out Persia. But the goat represents the persona of the serpent, lower self serpent persona. And the ram represents the person who's starting to recognize their spiritualization and the power of the Holy Spirit within them, and they're trying to ascend. Well, in that vision, the goat annihilates the ram, and which basically says, hey, you get to a place and something goes wrong, boom, and you get knocked back down. And that's what the goat does to us all the time. And Cain and Ishmael and Esau are symbolic to the goat, and that's the serpent persona. That's why satanic worshipers, they look at Baphomet as their god. It's a statue of a goat head, and it symbolizes the worship of man. And in the natural body mode, because that's what that's called, that first is the natural body mode that we travel in as along our caterpillar crawl. And then that's what Paul talks about, is to going into the spiritual body. And that's what the New Testament is about, is the ascension into that spiritualized body. But when you look at Cain and Abel, and then later Seth, Seth gives birth, and his lineage is later Noah. You have Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and those two are very important in the book of Revelation. And then you have, their children, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is the first, he's the lower self. Isaac's the higher self. God gave Isaac the second promise, which is, I'm gonna write the law on your hearts and in your minds. And at that point, the enmity between the two are gone, and that's what Jesus, I think it's Ephesians 4, Paul says, Jesus put to death the enmity between those two natures. And so serpent was gone, and the second Adam arrives. He's life-giving spirit, the last Adam. And I think that's symbolized by the Lamb in the book of Revelation. But all those progeny, and I'm going to stop with this, all those progeny of Adam and Eve, if you start with Adam and Eve as a single consciousness, what that symbolizes are branches within you from your original nature of all the experiences, the travels of your soul, and the nations that get built, and the battle between that part of you that wants to do good and that part of you that wants to stay carnal. And it's the higher versus the lower self. It's the Cain. What did Cain do when he was confronted with that first question? Cain and Abel gave God an offering, and God regarded Abel's, he disregarded Cain's. Cain's countenance fell. God said, man, why is your countenance fell? Why are you angry? So that's the first display of a personality, is anger. That's symbiotic with the lower self. And Cain turns around and kills Abel. I don't want to compete with that higher self. And I have the ability now, because I'm living down in Egypt, I'm going to kill that guy. And he killed him. Well, later, that was replaced by Seth. And that's always going to happen. And that's symbolic of the two witnesses in the book of Revelation that were killed, but they came back. They were resurrected. And then you got, Cain basically, God says, because you did that. Well, earlier he said, I don't know, you're angry. Sin's knocking at your door. You need to master it. So he tells that lower self, you need to master sin. And Cain just, I'm just going to kill the guy. And so then you get to, God says, hey, you're going to be a wanderer and vagabond, on the earth. And Cain says, I can't stand my punishment. I'm going to be separated from you forever. I'm going to be a wanderer and a vagabond on the face of the earth, the lower self. And whoever finds me is going to kill me. So there it is. That's the fear. So you got anger and you got fear. And God says, no, Cain, they're not going to kill you. And that's not how I designed this. They're not going to kill you. But Cain didn't believe him. And that part of us wants to exist, and it's always fearful. It's always fearful that when you find it, that you're going to kill it. And what you do is, that's what Paul, you got to put to death the flesh. It's a terrible master. The serpent persona is a terrible master, and that's what it is in the natural body. But it's supposed to be a servant, and you got to have it. So you don't kill Cain, but you remove him from running your life when you become Christed. And it's the same story with Isaac and Ishmael, and you had Ham, that came before them, and out of Ham came Canaan, and then you had the 7 nations of Canaan that are prominent in the Bible, and they're symbolic of the nations and the fortresses and the battle inside of you between the nations that are good and the nations that are not. And a lot of, if you can take some of that back to my giant, became a nation that I had to go conquer. I had to dissolve it. And it's my higher self looking at it and saying, that's the source of a lot of anxiety for you. And we've got to go, I was afraid of it for a long time. It was my Goliath. Saul's pitted against Goliath. Saul represents the higher self. And he was afraid of the giant. And he didn't go at it, because that's a giant inside of you. And you've got to go at it, because what happens when you fear something? I mean, you attract what you fear. And the only way to conquer it is you got to attack it back. And you got to refuse to be afraid. And so the higher self has to go in and nail that guy. And the way that happens is you call on the power of your innate spiritual nature, and God will help you. So here comes David. His name is David. It's the beloved of God, descendant of Jesse. And he kind of he's from the house of Ram. Get back to the visual of it, the goat and the ram, that spiritual ascension. David represents the mind, that's the person that's spiritually ascending, and every now and then they get slammed. But he picks up 5 smooth stones, and because there's 5 giants of our psyche related to the 5 senses. If we don't have control of our sense desire, it can breed giants. And the Philistines in the Bible, they had 5 big cities, and they were giants. And those represent the potential strongholds within our body that could become giants, like the giant that I had. And you slay it. Stone is symbolic of truth. So you take that slingshot with stone of truth, they hit him right to the forehead, which is where the pineal gland is, and that's presumably where the seat of your divine nature is. And it's all symbolic, and it fits that way. Then David and his army went on to kill the other 4 giants. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to stop with this, is before David killed the giant, he killed the lion and he killed a bear. Well, if you go back to the book of Daniel, the beast out of the sea, the first was a lion that stood like a man. And it just so happens that represents a god in the Egyptian times that was a patron of Pharaoh. It protected him in battle, that particular figure. And the lion is the beast of that lower nature of Egypt. And so before David could go into his ego and kill the 5 senses, the giants of that part of you, he had to kill the lion, which is the lowest of the low self. And then he had to kill the bear. Well, the bear is the second beast in Daniel. It's there, it has, 3 ribs in its mouth, and it's raised itself up on one side. And that's that generative function where sensuality and sexual drive. And I believe raising himself up on one side is he was sexually aroused. And he devoured much meat. He was going to do whatever he had to do to satisfy that sexual desire. And a lot of people get tripped up like that. You know. And but he had to kill the bear. He had to kill the beast of the first nature, the beast of the second nature, to get to that third nature, which is the seat of the ego, the seat of the power, the self-willed intellect. And all this really comes into play in the book of Revelation. But the symbolism there, you can't miss it. Because then he had to go on and kill the other four giants, potential giants of that nature. But here it is. In the book of Genesis, they start out in Egypt in slavery. And that's where they end up. They tried to get out of Egypt to the land that was promised, and a lot of things happened. But at some point, the descendants of Jacob began to intermarry, the descendants of Ishmael and Esau. And that's when God says, you can't serve two masters. The lower self can never accommodate the higher self can never accommodate the lower self. When you try to do that, you're destined for failure. When you try to mix into this world and make both sides of the equation work, you're done. And it's just, that's our tendency, and that's what the whole book of Genesis shows, that ultimately you're gonna make these travels, and you're gonna make progress, but then you might find yourself slammed right back in Egypt again. And then you gotta come back out. Every great man of the Bible went into Egypt to come out. In meditation, you gotta go into Egypt. New Testament says, Ephesians, Jesus, he ascended, but it also means that he descended into the lower parts of the earth. That he descended, he went in, and he had to descend to the lower parts of the earth before he could ascend. Jesus went into Egypt, came out. Abraham, same thing. Jacob, Moses, all of them. They had to go to Egypt before they could go out. And that's all symbolic of what's going on inside of us as we do that work to get to the promised land. There's so many other things. I could get in so many rabbit trails and go down, but it's already 53 minutes. Man, if you watched all this, thank you. I'll come back with the end. You guys take care until then. Bye-bye.